All right, we're now going to hear a talk from Teresa Hoogeveen from the University of Barcelona, entitled From Liberation to Freedom, Notes on Hannah Arendt and Françoise Collin.
Thank you very much, Aaron. I would like to start by thanking the organization of the IAPh for the opportunity to be here and to have this dialogue with so many people. It's been very interesting. I will now start. So in my preparation for today's paper, I found myself returning to the abstract to remember my proposal from a year and a half ago, like probably many of us did, because I think that was quite common. As I read it, I remembered part of the research I was planning to complete, the paper for the IAPh being a good deadline for that research. So it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, and IAPh is going to be the place where I'm going to, have it all closed up, and realize that with the beginning of the pandemic, so were those plans put aside. I was, however, no less surprised to discover that more than a year later, I have returned to the two concepts included in the title of this paper, liberation and freedom, as one of the fundamental axes in my PhD dissertation, which wasn't so clear a year and a half ago. So that's been very interesting. My approach to them, however, has changed since I first sent my proposal. Given that I am currently writing the chapter that organizes around liberation and freedom, I would like to explain my current understanding of what Françoise Collin takes from Hannah Arendt and how she, in her own way, goes beyond Hannah Arendt. It is appropriate to begin with an introduction of Françoise Collin, a much less known figure than Hannah Arendt. Collin was born in Belgium, in Braine-le-Comte in Belgium in 1928, and she died also in Belgium in Saint-Sever in 2012, so she died recently. Her first publications were a collection of poems and two fiction novels in the beginning of the 60s, published by Sewil. And her doctoral thesis, written and presented during the second half of the 60s, was the first monograph dedicated to Maurice Blanchot. In the early 70s, she traveled to New York, where she discovered North American feminism, more specifically feminism in New York, but she then did like a more general discovery of North American feminism. When she returned to Brussels after that trip, 3 months later, she set out to found, together with a handful of other women, Les Cahiers du CRIF, the first second-wave francophone feminist journal. It's interesting that it's a journal, not a magazine. And the first issue of this journal was distributed on 11 November 1973. It was published on a 3-monthly basis for the following 5 years. The first series of this journal came to an end in 1978 with a double volume containing issues 23 and 24. So in total, the first series was 24 issues. And this last issue was titled Où en sont les féministes? Where are the feminists? This information, I know it's a lot of years, but it's relevant for how I'm going to work through my paper. So I'll keep going back to it, and I'll keep reminding you of why, which part of the story we're in. Collin's reading of Arendt began in the early 80s, having found a book of hers in an American bookstore. So we have Collin, writer in the 60s, doctoral thesis, end of the 60s, feminism 70s, Arendt 80s. Her passion for the political theorist would continue throughout her life, next to her already impassionate intellectual relationship with Maurice Blanchot. Collin's intellectual affinity to Arendt, I contend, is due to the fact that Arendt allowed her to break free from a constricting Marxist conceptual framework that was clearly insufficient when it came to understanding the specificity of the political and the specificity of art. For different reasons that I will not elaborate here very extensively, but that include the classical understanding of culture as a superstructure and the dialectical nature of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. So both of these facts were quite constricting for Collin in what she was trying to do already in the 60s and the 70s. So Collin approached the specificity of art through the lens of écriture, a point of view that emerged from her experience as a writer and from her analysis of Blanchot. Sometime later, as we have seen, Arendt became central in her philosophy as a thinker because she was a thinker, Arendt, who highlighted the specificity of the political and committed to a non-metaphysical understanding of it, as well as explored its relationship to history and to storytelling, both of which are very important in Collin's thinking as well. Françoise Collin was thus a writer, a philosopher, and a protagonist of the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes from the 70s onward, a combination which has left us a unique understanding of feminism together with a highly analytical while also literary philosophical oeuvre. It is worth noting that within those early years, the decades of the 80s, Collin was pioneering and original in her introduction of Arendt as a significant figure for feminist political and philosophical thinking, a gesture that seems almost obvious to us nowadays. We only need to think of Adriana Caballero, Linda Zerilli, or Judith Butler, among many others. Today, I want to concentrate on how Arendt's distinction between liberation and freedom connects to Collin's understanding of the political, of art, and the work of art, chiefly in relation to women's artistic creations. So I will concentrate on art, work of art related to women's artistic creations. Arendt's distinction between liberation and freedom has been studied and contested. Hannah Pitkin pointed out in her seminal essay, Are Freedom and Liberty Twins?, that Arendt's distinction between freedom and liberty is one she establishes in certain moments, but does not strictly follow herself, in a very Arendtian fashion, I might add. However, aware I am that the distinction is not fixed, I will outline it succinctly, basically because Collin, unlike Pitkin, does not stop and reflect on the etymological and semantical differences between liberty and freedom. As a matter of fact, she translates freedom as liberté, and thus moves on to contrapose libération and liberté in French without considering the etymological or conceptual consequences of the word liberty in English. Let us proceed. In On Revolution, Arendt writes, I quote, "It may be a truism to say that liberation and freedom are not the same. That liberation may be the condition of freedom, but by no means leads automatically to it. That the notion of liberty implied in liberation can only be negative, and hence that even the intentions of liberating is not identical with the desire for freedom." I close quote. We find thus two distinct definitions. One that corresponds to liberation and is negative per se, another expressed by the term freedom that gives us a positive meaning. Liberation means emancipation, to liberate oneself from the necessities of life, which in turn bestows upon those liberated the status of a free man. And I quote Arendt here, which enable him to move, to get away from home, to go out into the world and meet other people in deed and word. I close quote. To liberate oneself from the necessities of life is, however, not enough. Freedom contains its own specificity, one that is positive insofar as its field of experience is action, and requires, and I quote Arendt, the company of other men who are in the same state and a common space to meet them. That is, a politically organized world, in other words, into which each of the free men can insert himself by word and deed. I close quote. Collin's own definition of the political and feminism as one of the principal political movements of the 20th century echoes Arendt's understanding of the political. This echo can already be found before she began reading Arendt. In the article Pour une politique féministe, fragment d'horizon, published in 1975, let me remind you that she began reading Arendt in the 80s and we're in 75, she defines feminism as, and I quote, a praxis oriented but mobile, incessantly innovating. I close quote. She clearly states that it is not a doctrine or an economism. To her, feminism is, and I open quote, the ferment of all feminist action in all traditional circuits and structures, and at the same time constitutive of parallel savage circuits and actions. I close quote. By 2001, so we're more than 20 years later, she would formulate these same ideas in the following terms. And I quote, feminism is a plural politics and a politics of the unrepresentable, namely a politics without a representation of a model. Close quote. Collin picked up on Arendt's definition and often highlighted its paradoxical nature, which she wrote in the following terms. So Collin looks at Arendt's definition of liberation and freedom, and she says, here we have a paradox. And I quote how she phrases it. If liberation is the condition of freedom, then there can, however, be no liberation if one is not already free. I close quote. The Belgian philosopher would repeat this paradox and approach it from different perspectives in several of her articles. Sometimes a paradox would introduce the problem of the subject's tendency to go from oppressed to master. At other times, the need to be free would be expressed and explored through a passion for freedom. At other times still, the problem would be the need for representation of the oppressed, the same that might once again return the oppressed to their status of oppression. In these explorations, she returned again and again to the same question: how to think this paradox without transforming it into a vicious circle. Furthermore, she agreed with Arendt's statement that freedom is not freedom of will, and wrote, and I quote, "Freedom, liberté, is not freedom of choice between pre-existing terms. It is the excess of those same terms." I close quote. This also means that freedom lies beyond the means and logic. So, while it is fundamental to always keep in sight the world we are aiming for, that we want to go towards, the point is to not confuse the world that we want with the application of an already pre-established structure or model that will allow us to reach it. So the idea is, yes, we envision the world that we want, the changes that we want, but that doesn't mean that we establish a previous model that tells us exactly how the world is going to be and how we get there. Finally, Colin was straightforward in stating that freedom clearly requires certain material conditions, but that only improving or changing material conditions is insufficient in order to be free. Concerning Colin, it is key to keep in mind that this distinction between liberation and freedom is profoundly rooted in her experience of the coincidence of politics and freedom. In this way, she answers to Arendt's call to return a concept to its original experience, or to an experience, while also introducing a more nuanced understanding of the ontological, political, ethical, and aesthetical complexities involved in the distinction between these two experiences that are liberation and freedom. In a wide sense, the experience I speak of is clearly the Mouvement de Libération des Femmes, that she was a protagonist of since the early 1970s. In a more specific sense, the experience that is mobilized in this distinction between liberation and freedom is that of Les Cahiers du Griffe, which at the same time is intimately linked to Colin's own position with the group of the Griffe and her being a writer and philosopher. As I mentioned, the first series of Les Cahiers du Griffe, the journal that Colin co-founded in 1973 with several other women, ended in 1978. The first series. Afterwards, we have a second series, but I'm going to stick to this first series. The group that published this journal was called Les Griffes, an acronym that stands for Groupe de Recherche et Information Féministe, and a play on words with the French term griffer, or to scratch. There are many reasons for the decision to stop publishing, and they themselves, so the group Les Griffes, explicated them in the article Au revoir, which is the main article of this last issue that they published in the 70s. However, in Colin's farewell article, we can see that her personal reasons are of a different nature than those of the whole group. As she herself narrates, after her encounter with feminism in New York in early 1973, she had first lived the women's movement as the possibility, and I quote, to stop being afraid, to wander without code and without schedule, to invent for each relation its own rights, to remove obstacles, to remove deforming mirrors and intermediaries, to lift the law. I close quote. By 1978, she had reconsidered the viability of what she had previously envisioned. Her experience in the Griffe showed her that, and I quote again, the supposed spontaneity of the collective imposes implicit laws and censorship that have the particularity of being almost irreparable and which cannot be confronted. The absence of power allows more disturbing powers to come into play. The absence of norms authorizes the functioning of a norm that is all the more hopeless because it is invisible and mobile. The suppression of roles opens the abyss of the problem of identity. And I close quote. The dimension of collective work that actively preoccupied her at the moment, so at that specific moment in 1978, was the group becoming a break or a censorship. The fact is that before being a feminist, Colin had been a philosopher. And still before, and more relevantly, I dare say, is the fact that Colin considered herself to be, first and foremost, perhaps, this is another discussion, a writer of literature. Literary writing, écriture, in turn, and as can be seen in her doctoral dissertation, Maurice Blanchot et la question de l'écriture, is not a simple concept or practice for Collin. To give depth to Collin's short farewell text, it is helpful to briefly review a couple of definitory traits of literary writing. According to her, language is constitutively plural. Collin will continue to explore this later. And in literary writing, language is free of external constraints. This means that it operates by exceeding the means and logic, or what Collin describes in her doctoral thesis as the world that is governed by the economic principle of production and exchange that assures that nothing is lost, that everything is retrievable. This also means that while literary writing communicates something, its definitory trait is not communication, much in the same way as the something that is set in motion through writing and reading is not an ultimate truth that must be reached, comprehended, and dominated as if it were an object, but something that is played out with every act of writing and every act of reading. This level of philosophical abstraction and complex literary theory was inadequate for Le Cahier du Rif, at least in its initial stages. At first, however, this was not a problem for Collin. Her desire in creating the Cahiers was not to unite highly complex philosophical theory on literature with feminist militantism, but to give her writing skills to the feminist cause. This meant, by definition, that her writing would no longer run freely. She had herself turned writing into a means for an end. By 1978, she acknowledged that two different types of writing had emerged in her practice. First, and I quote, one for the Grief, for women, readable, thinking, useful, clear. And second, another one for her, at the limit of illegibility, useless, and uncertain. I close quote. Collin would uphold this separation throughout the rest of her life, even if at times a little problematically, probably also because she actually found a way for these two types of writing to nourish each other. However, and this is the core issue in 1978, she failed in showing this connection to others around her and found that her feminist colleagues dismissed her literary writing in a way that compared to the obstacles she faced in the man-governed literary and philosophical worlds. This failure is key. Collin's disappointment emerges at this point in 1978. In her farewell article, she expressed her own failings in being able to be both a feminist and a writer, to merge these two aspects of herself in one. A second problem arose, however, that I think was much deeper, much more serious. Le Cahier du Rif, de Grief, and Belgian feminists disdain for literary writing. Collin argued that within these spaces and groups, literary writing was only allowed if it was under the signature of an accomplished author, one that already had name and fame, such as Beauvoir, Duras, Woolf. If not, and I quote, writing is useful writing, I close quote. And so a deep-seated utilitarianism would be mobilized, one that would even result, and I quote again, in the reactions of surprise and almost indignation of the very beautiful issue of Le Cahier du Rif titled and dedicated to Gertrude Stein. So what her colleagues said about this issue was, it means nothing, it is useless. I close quote. Despite her disappointment at the movement's relationship to literature, it appears that by the end of the first series, Collin was reconciled with the fact that not all feminists, and consequently not all women, had a desire to write. Edwige Peymans-Boulay, one of her colleagues in the Grief, wrote, I quote, Françoise Collin thinks today that we should not expect all feminists to begin writing. A womb is sufficient on its own. It does not need, in order to prove its existence, to be justified by the production of a child. I close quote. Collin's frustration in this farewell article is double-edged. She is disappointed at herself for being unable to join literary and feminist writing. She is disappointed at the group for their dismissal of literature as bourgeois, or in other terms, as luxury and gratuitous fantasy. To her, the group values her writing when it is useful, when it is dedicated to the cause, that is, to women's social and economical issues, so when elucidating the functioning of violence or the importance of housework, etc. However, when it unfolds freely in its tendency towards the unknown and it becomes useless, the group dismisses it as worthless. Well, Now, when it goes towards the unknown and becomes useless, that is the moment that the group dismisses it as worthless. In other terms, when her writing is dedicated to the libération of women, to denouncing and improving their material conditions, then she is accepted. When it is an act of freedom, of introducing herself into the symbolic sphere, there she finds a clear barrier. It is in this sense that the two terms, liberation and freedom, answer to what Collin calls the material and the symbolic. As a matter of fact, Collin's philosophy, feminism, and writing, all these aspects of her life, are in accordance with the fact that to her, and I quote, art is the place par excellence of the exercise of freedom. I close quote. I would like to finish my paper by unpacking or breaking this quote down. As I have already said, Collin considers herself a writer, a philosopher. She was also an art and literary critic and a well-known literary theorist. Her PhD dissertation on the problem of writing in Maurice Panchaud is a phenomenological study of the act of writing that extensively analyzes the questions of what literature is, what writing is, why one writes, what a work of art is, etc. These questions continue to inform her philosophical and political practice by both conjugating and limiting them, as can be seen in her critique of approaching women's creations as an exhibit of the feminine or as a consequence of being a woman. To Collin, the act of writing may be informed by the fact of being a woman, but it doesn't necessarily enclose it. So the fact of being a woman, you cannot reduce the act of writing to that fact of being a woman. Fundamentally, the freedom of the artist must rely on that possible generalization of the singular of each writer and act of writing. I dare say that what Collin is putting forth is that the act of writing, which she studied closely, as I already mentioned, occurs in such a space and manner that it is possible that being a woman is indifferent. This same indifference operates in the act of reading what a woman has written. So basically reading the creation of a woman through the lens of she's a woman is one of the possible lenses. In certain moments and in a very political way, it is one of the most relevant, politically speaking, but it is not the only way, and it is problematic when it is the only way in which we read women. In writing and reading, being a woman may or may not be relevant. It is a framework to read from, like I was saying. The point is that in publishing or finding an audience, and here we walk straight into the political, being a woman is always clearly and shamefully relevant. There is a reason why I have chosen this example when trying to elucidate in this short presentation what Collin understands to be the problem of the importance of the difference between liberation and freedom. The reason is basically that the material conditions for writing, so Virginia Woolf's room of one's own, or what Collin calls the conditions of creation, are fundamental for a woman to be able to write. But the problem is not solved by having a room of one's own. That is, by satisfying the necessary conditions of creation. If the symbolic continues to operate in the same way it did before, a woman's writing, or her art, her political opinions, her actions of the world, whatever, will continue to find obstacles that include not being published, or if we consider publication to be part of the material conditions, which is possible, that will include not being read once she is published. In typical Collin fashion, in her work, she emphasizes the centrality of the conditions of reception and how these are connected to the symbolic. To explain these conditions of reception, let us imagine that a woman's creations overcome all these difficulties. Let us imagine that she has the material possibilities, no matter how scant, to write poetry or a novel, fiction, whatever, to create pieces of art, and then finds the place to publish these. And furthermore, she has an audience who is interested in what she has created. In that case, once again, if the symbolic continues to operate in its traditional way, she will be reduced to the fact of being a woman, or exclusively as a representation of the feminine, thus reproducing the dominant culture's, and I quote here, obstinacy to read women writers exclusively in their particularity and enclosing them in it. I close quote. Collin once described the difficulties of the political by stating that political life needs to be both risky. The political life needs both risky options and constantly renewed vigilance. There are no guaranteed options, no options without effects that return to us. Analyzing women's production in order to highlight their singularity and its relationship to the universal is one of those risky options, and may I say profoundly feminist. Reducing them to being a woman or to the feminine is still something that Collin would argue we need to be vigilant against, or for. Returning to Collin's understanding of freedom, eventually problematized and understood through Arendt's own definition and clearly rooted in her own experience of the women's liberation movement, then, and I quote Collin here, what is important is that women create, because creating is to make something come into being without predetermination, I close quote. To conclude, may I point out that to make something come into being without predetermination is also what praxis, action in the Arendtian sense, does in the political realm. Action brings something into the common world that wasn't there before. It is for this reason, then, that to Collin, and I quote, art is a place par excellence of the existence of freedom. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for the talk.